What happens when an arrogant judge mocks a woman without realizing she was once a military operative? Brookdale District Court, New York, 8:30 a.m. The air in the courtroom was heavy. The hushed murmurs faded as the heavy wooden doors swung open. A woman stepped in, her posture straight, each step deliberate. Naomi Carter, 32 years old, a former Army Ranger who had served for a decade. Though she no longer wore the uniform, the sharp discipline remained. A perfectly tailored navy blue suit, long black hair neatly tied back, and eyes that scanned the room like she was assessing a battlefield. But today was no battlefield. Today was a legal fight. Naomi walked to the defense table, took her seat, and remained composed. Across from her sat Ethan Calloway, a wealthy landlord, his expression bored, as if this trial was nothing more than a routine formality. He was the man behind her eviction notice, a blatant act of discrimination he assumed no one would challenge. From the judge's bench, Randall Grayson skimmed through the case file, then smirked. "Well, this is interesting. Miss Carter, do you think you can march into this courtroom with a military attitude and start giving orders?" A few chuckles rippled through the room. Calloway folded his arms, his smirk widening. Naomi didn't respond immediately. But inside, a strategy was already taking shape. This fight was far from over. Judge Marcus Lowell leaned forward, flipping through a few pages of the file before him. His face bore a mix of indifference and contempt. "Sergeant Carter? Former military, huh? More like a mercenary." His voice dragged with a mocking smirk. Naomi didn't react. She simply observed. Lowell's eyes swept over her from head to toe, then he shook his head slightly. "You do realize this is a courtroom, not a military base, don't you? The way you stand, the way you look at me, it doesn't fit here, Miss Carter. In this room, the law speaks, not your combat training." A few chuckles came from Calloway and the men seated behind him. Some in the courtroom exchanged glances, a bit uneasy with the judge's tone, but no one spoke up. Naomi remained steady. She took a slow breath, placed both hands on the table, and tilted her head slightly. "Your Honor, I'm not here to teach you about the military. I'm here for justice." Lowell raised an eyebrow. "Oh, justice?" He let out a dry chuckle. "Tell me, Miss Carter, do you actually think you can win this case? You, a jobless tenant against a landlord with a legal contract? You believe in justice? Or is this just another ex-soldier clinging to some illusion of power?" His words were sharp, arrogant, designed to cut deep. Naomi's fingers curled slightly. She could feel her heartbeat in her chest. Not from anger, but from recognition. This was no different from standing before a condescending superior in the military. "I'm not delusional, Your Honor," she said, her voice measured and calm. "I simply believe in the truth. And the truth is, Mr. Calloway has violated federal tenant protection laws." Silence fell over the room. Lowell blinked, then let out a dry, humorless laugh, half mockery, half irritation. "You think you can stand here, throw around a few legal terms, and expect me to believe you?" He suddenly cut her off. "Listen to me, Sergeant. You might be used to giving orders in the military, but in this courtroom, I make the decisions." He slammed his stamp onto the desk. "You do not lecture me about the law." A few in the courtroom flinched. The tension thickened in the air. But Naomi remained composed. She locked eyes with the judge, unwavering. Then slowly, she placed a stack of documents onto the table, undeniable evidence, and she knew this game was just beginning. Judge Lowell shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze dripping with disdain. "You seem quite confident, but there's one major problem. You don't understand the law. You can talk about your so-called rights all you want, but at the end of the day, you're just a former soldier, completely ignorant of how this legal system works." His voice was cold, laced with challenge. Naomi's face remained calm. Slowly, deliberately, she rose from her seat. She didn't rush, but every movement carried purpose. The courtroom fell silent. All eyes locked onto her. "Your Honor, if you think I'm just a former soldier with no understanding of the law—" She paused, a faint smile crossing her lips. "Then you're gravely mistaken." With measured precision, she pulled a stack of documents from her leather case and placed them on the table. "I'm not just any soldier, Your Honor. I was a tactical advisor for military operations in the Middle East." The room seemed to hold its breath. Faces that once bore doubt now showed subtle shifts. A few people in the crowd began looking at Naomi with newfound respect. Judge Lowell's expression didn't waver, but his brow furrowed slightly. He said nothing. Naomi stood firm, her eyes gleaming with quiet determination. I've coordinated counterterrorism missions, worked alongside military forces from multiple nations, and made critical decisions in the most high-pressure situations imaginable. I know how to analyze data, assess threats, and execute plans with precision. So when you imply that I lack an understanding of legal strategy, she let the words hang. That's a mistake I've never made, Your Honor. She paused, letting her words settle. She wasn't in a hurry. She knew every sentence carried weight. A hushed murmur spread through the courtroom. The air had shifted. The condescension from earlier? Fading. Judge Lowell's mask of indifference remained, but a flicker of hesitation crossed his eyes. Across the room, Calloway, her landlord, was visibly rattled. He shot up from his chair, slamming a hand onto the table. Your Honor, this is completely irrelevant. She may have a military background, but this case is about a lease agreement, not battlefield tactics, he barked. Naomi remained unfazed. She simply turned to Calloway, her expression unreadable. Irrelevant? She said smoothly. Mr. Calloway, it's your unlawful actions that brought me here in the first place. Her voice was calm, steady, but it carried an unmistakable edge. You may have thought you were dealing with someone powerless, but you were wrong. I have more than enough evidence to prove your violations of tenant protection laws. One by one, Naomi laid out documents, records of transactions, lease amendments, and eviction threats Calloway had hoped would remain buried. He had strong-armed tenants, coerced them into signing illegal contracts, and violated federal housing regulations. The weight of her evidence thickened the tension in the air. Calloway paled. His confidence wavered. His lawyers scrambled to object, grasping at any angle to discredit the documents Naomi had just presented. The audience in the courtroom murmured. Some were stunned by her resilience. Others whispered in awe at her precise dismantling of Calloway's defenses. Judge Lowell exhaled slowly, his composure cracking. He glanced from Naomi to the documents before him, absorbing the undeniable proof. And you expect me to accept all of this at face value? His tone had shifted, no longer outright dismissive. Naomi didn't answer right away. She met his gaze, unwavering. She knew she had just taken a critical step forward. Judge Lowell felt the challenge in Naomi's gaze, and it infuriated him. He would not allow a woman, especially a former soldier, to defy him so openly in his own courtroom. His anger flared. Who do you think you are? He roared, his voice echoing through the chamber. Don't think that your so-called toughness from the military will get you anywhere here. You're not in the army anymore, Naomi. This is my courtroom, and people like you, people who lack respect, will be dismissed. Naomi remained unmoved. She stood her ground, her expression composed, but there was something different in her eyes now. A sharpness, a readiness for battle. Your Honor, she said, her voice even, unwavering. I am not a woman who can be intimidated. And I didn't come here to play your power games. I came for justice, justice for the unlawful actions of Mr. Calloway. Lowell clenched his jaw. He wanted to crush her defiance, to put her in her place, but he couldn't ignore the way the energy in the room had shifted. She had captured the courtroom's attention, and now he was struggling to wrest it back. You're wasting this court's time, Naomi, he snapped. If you don't show proper respect for these proceedings, I will dismiss this case right now. A sudden noise rippled through the courtroom. The tension thickened. All eyes turned toward the gallery as a man stood up. Captain Daniel Hayes. Naomi's breath caught. She hadn't expected to see him here today. He had been her comrade on more missions than she could count. But what stunned the courtroom wasn't just his presence. It was what he was about to say. Tall and broad-shouldered, Hayes stepped forward, the remnants of his old uniform still commanding authority. His presence alone carried weight. Your Honor, he said, voice deep, firm, and unwavering. I am Captain Daniel Hayes, former unit commander and direct teammate of Naomi Carter. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Naomi could feel the atmosphere shifting. Hayes turned, locking eyes with Lowell, then continued, his words crisp and deliberate. I'm here to testify to the corruption of Mr. Calloway. I personally witnessed the illegal transactions he was involved in while Naomi and I were deployed. His fraudulent dealings with real estate and government contracts were not just unethical, they were criminal. Naomi's hands clenched into fists. She hadn't expected an ally in this fight, but now she had one, and the surprises weren't over. Hayes glanced at Naomi, then back at the courtroom. Beyond that, he added, Naomi is not just any former soldier. She led a hostage rescue mission in Afghanistan, one of the most dangerous operations ever executed. Under her command, an elite team infiltrated enemy territory, breached a fortified compound, and saved innocent lives. That mission is still studied in military circles today. She didn't just survive it, she made it possible. The courtroom erupted into hushed whispers. The weight of Hayes's words hung thick in the air. People stared at Naomi with newfound awe. No longer was she just some tenant fighting an eviction. She was something else entirely, something few could have imagined. Even Lowell couldn't mask his surprise. His expression flickered, just for a moment, but Naomi caught it. Her past was no longer just a footnote. It was a statement. She wasn't just resilient, she was a warrior. And today she wouldn't stop until justice was served. Judge Lowell thought he had the upper hand. He had underestimated Naomi Carter. But Naomi had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the truth wouldn't just clear her name, but expose the corruption sitting right on the judge's bench. She moved toward the evidence table, her posture steady, her hands gliding swiftly over the stack of documents she had meticulously prepared. Every step she took was like a hidden strike, a calculated maneuver. She lifted her head, her gaze locking onto Lowell's, her voice steady but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. Your Honor, I have a few documents I'd like to present. These will not only prove that Mr. Calloway has engaged in illegal activities, but will also reveal clear evidence of judicial misconduct, your misconduct. A hush fell over the courtroom. The only sound was the rustling of paper as Naomi flipped through her files. The weight of 100 eyes wasn't just on her, it was on Judge Lowell. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. He struggled to keep his expression cold and unreadable, but Naomi could see the flicker of unease beneath the surface. She continued, pulling out records of Calloway's suspicious transactions, documents he had tried to bury. But that wasn't all. She had something even more damning. She held up printed copies of emails. These emails, Naomi declared, prove that Judge Lowell has been in direct communication with Calloway on multiple occasions. The content of these exchanges makes it abundantly clear that there is more than just a professional relationship between you two. And that, Your Honor, compromises the integrity of this entire case. Lowell's eyes widened, his lips pressed into a tight line. The tension in the room became suffocating. And then, Naomi played her final hand. The courtroom lights dimmed, and the screen flickered to life. A military training video began playing. The footage was from Naomi's time in service. She was on a training ground, leading a unit in defensive tactics. She wasn't just standing on the sidelines, she was in command. Her voice carried authority as she barked out orders, instructing soldiers on how to fortify a position, how to counter an ambush, how to adapt under pressure. She was a leader, a strategist, a force to be reckoned with. The video wasn't just proof of her military experience, it was proof of who she was. A silence fell over the room as the video played. People weren't just looking at Naomi now, they were seeing her. Judge Lowell, on the other hand, was unraveling. His face turned pale, his breath came shorter. His gaze was locked onto the screen, unable to look away, as if he were watching his own downfall play out in real time. The evidence was undeniable. Naomi scanned the crowd. She could hear the murmurs rising from the back of the courtroom. The tide was turning. This wasn't just about a legal battle anymore. This was a reckoning. And Naomi Carter wasn't backing down. Judge Lowell sat frozen, his face drained of color, unable to refute the mountain of evidence stacked against him. His fingers twitched as he clenched the armrests of his chair, his jaw tightening as if he were trying to will himself into denying the inevitable. But deep down, he knew. The game was over. With a reluctant sigh, his voice strained and hollow, he finally spoke. I recuse myself from this case. A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Then, a ripple of applause, hesitant at first, but growing. Some stood nodding in respect toward Naomi. Others whispered among themselves, marveling at the woman who had just dismantled not only a corrupt property owner, but the very judge presiding over the case. Yet Naomi did not bask in the moment. Her work was not finished. She turned, her gaze shifting toward Calloway. He sat stiffly, his face a shade paler than before, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape route. But there was none. The investigations into his fraudulent dealings and illegal evictions were inevitable now. His empire of deceit was crumbling before him, and Naomi had made sure there would be no place left for him to hide. She looked back at Lowell one last time. There was no smugness in her expression, no gloating, just a steady, knowing gaze, because she had seen this ending long before they had. Naomi stepped out of the courtroom, her heart lighter, yet her mind still replaying everything that had unfolded. She hadn't won just for herself, she had won for all those who had been oppressed, for those who had no voice in society. As she crossed the courthouse threshold, a faint smile formed on her lips, but inside, she carried an overwhelming sense of pride. A single thought echoed in her mind, the words she had always lived by. They forgot one thing. Soldiers never fight alone. The sunlight cast a warm glow on Naomi's face. She stood there, a woman of strength and resilience, victorious not just for justice, but for everything she had always believed in and fought to protect.